What is going on, guys? It is your boy Garage Gaming here, and today I am doing a lecture on Soviet tank design, mainly why the Soviets developed so many main battle tanks at the same time, with the differentiation between the models included. So, the main idea behind this is explaining why the Soviets developed so many main battle tanks of different types, because as you can clearly see, mainly using War Thunder as a template here rather than for gameplay reasons, you can see that they developed many different types of what I would consider a main battle tank, but, you know, without some context first, it wouldn't really make much sense. So, to start off with, we need to go back to the post-Second World War situation for the Soviet Army. We're looking at the T-34-85 here. Now, this thing is quite a successful tank in my eyes for the Soviet Union in winning the war. We've got an excellent 85mm gun. We have a whole bunch of other factors, ease of production, simplicity. But there are a couple of flaws with this vehicle coming out of the Second World War. So a couple of things to note here is that this tank actually, they stopped production of this vehicle in 1945. But they continued production after 1947 due to the increasing tensions with the West. Okay, so between 1950 and 1958, approximately 9,000 more of these tanks were produced. Okay, now this was a good tank for the Second World War, but as we start to see vehicles like Centurion and the M48 and the M46 patterns coming out in Korea, where these things actually had to fight tanks like Centurion and M46, you get a better picture painted. This thing just does not cut it anymore. Indeed, this thing cannot actually handle the bigger and better 100mm gun because the suspension starts wearing out on the vehicle. So it already cannot fit a bigger gun. But the main problem with this vehicle was actually the hull. So if you see the armored sidearm, the side armor here, it's built at an angle. Now, side armor protection was, this may have been adequate in the 1930s when this tank's hull was actually designed, but it is no longer adequate anymore for modern anti-tank guns and the likes. So whatever space you're wasting internally does not justify the side armor. So you've got this volumetric concern where the interior of the tank is so cramped because of the angled side armor. The other issue is the tank's center of gravity is so far forward. As you can see, the turret here is mounted so far forward because of the damn length of the engine. The engine adds this height, and because of the way it's mounted, it takes up like half the damn vehicle, or at least a good third of the vehicle's mass. So the turret has to be mounted all the way far forward here. And the problem with that is that you can't really increase the frontal protection on the hull when the turret's this far forward. Otherwise, you've got to do some work to the suspension, and that just complicates things. So you've got the issue with volumetric concerns with the side and rear armor being sloped like this. You've got the turret and suspension not able to take, well, the turret can take a bigger gun, but then it's even more cramped, and the suspension can't handle the firing of that bigger gun. You can't increase the frontal armor because the turret's too far forward. This design is essentially capped, and what we have is, once the Soviet Army develops something better, these just get flogged off to all the other nations, so all the client states and all of the sort of perceived allies of the Soviet Union. And what we end up with is the T-44. Now, this thing never actually to me, this is more of a stepping stone than an actual mainline tank, because to me the T-44 does not replace the T-34 in my eyes. The T-34 is replaced by the T-54, but we'll get into how we get there. So T-44 mounts the engine in the center, so now you've got the center of mass much further back. We can now literally double the frontal armor protection on the vehicle. Okay, we use a pretty similar turret to the T-34-85, so the firepower issue is not addressed. But the way we do this is by mounting the engine sideways, okay? So all of a sudden, we have all this extra room. We can add in ammunition, we can add in all this other stuff. The vehicle's profile is lowered massively because of this, okay? And yeah, so we lose the inverse, or the sort of angled side, so we don't have to deal with angled side armor anymore, so we're not as cramped. The engine's moved further back, so we've got a bit more comfort this time. And then we're starting to see the shape of the Soviet vehicles. Now, main problem with T-44 is that T-44 could not reliably mount a larger gun. So, in real life, T-44's internal turret was extremely cramped. Operating the 100mm gun was just not practical. So, they redesigned the turret, and then we move on to this baby. So, this is the T-54. T-54 addresses all the problems that you had with T-44 and T-34-85. This thing's obviously developed like way back in 1947, and yeah, this is how it all gets started. So T-54 still has the sideways mounted engine, or the transverse engine, sorry, and then we have the beautiful 100mm gun in action. We have a much thicker frontal hull armor. This later gets reduced to 100mm because they find that the majority of hits occur in the top 2/3 of the vehicle. So they figure out that, you know, they could save weight. So it incorporates all the lessons. So sideways engine, straight side armor, better upper frontal plate, and the very strong turret. The redesigned turret actually, you know, to accommodate the 100mm gun. Now this design gets refined a little bit, and we later go on to the sort of penultimate production version of the T-54. Now, this turret is something to take note of, because this turret, this dome turret design, this does not go away with the Soviet tanks. This is, you know, it obviously gets tweaked and changed, but this general layout of this very rounded dome-shaped turret, that does not go away on any Soviet tank. You know, we have to get to the T-14 Armata to see a major change, or maybe the T-90 MS, to actually see a massive change to the turret. But other than it, like this turret design stays, so that's really important. So the T-54 is a very, very successful tank, and they can begin phasing out the T-34-85s with these things being produced. I believe that this is the most produced tank in the world. So they produce 100,000 of these in its entire production run, okay? So this thing accounts for, like, you know, the Soviet Union builds 86,000 of these tanks over its entire production run, which is like 20 or 30 years. So you can sort of paint the picture where the Soviets are starting to mass produce these tanks to replace its large fleet of T-34s. And they also find that, so the Soviets still have the heavy tanks in service. This thing would probably outperform most of them. So IS-1 and IS-2, to me, let's just go and visit them actually. So IS-1 and IS-1 was made obsolete by the T-34-85. IS-2, this tank is more of an artillery piece on wheels, because this tank was notoriously blind. Its vision was just terrible. Germans would apparently shoot at this thing, and they'd just be sitting there like, well, where'd that come from? To me, this tank is more or less a moving artillery piece rather than a proper heavy tank. Alright, it did get modernized later on, but, you know, Soviets and they have their reasons. So the IS-3, big scary looking thing that was brought out on the Victory Parade in 1945, looks like the scariest thing ever. The Allies were terrified of this thing. But as it turns out, the build quality on these was apparently really bad. Like, really, really bad. So, I don't know, if I had to pick between this thing and a T-54, I'd probably go with the T-54, you know. The only really dangerous Soviet heavy tank was the T-10. The T-10M was, or the T-10 when it was introduced, this thing was easily the most dangerous and powerful tank in the world. Nothing one-on-one could take this thing on and win, I reckon. It just had the semi-automatic loading system for the gun itself, the ammunition it could fire, the armor, the mobility, the stabilizer. This thing was an absolute demon. But the Soviets were slowly realizing that heavy tanks and medium tanks were sort of starting to blur the lines. They wanted something that could do both. They wanted something that was not too heavy. That's why tanks like IS-7 and IS-6, go the way of the dodo, because we start seeing rounds and anti-tank guided missiles that can just go straight through these things. So yeah, so we have the heavy tanks still, of course, but we're not really advancing forward in the regard of like armor protection and stuff like that just yet. So the T54, as all good as it is, this was an amazing tank when it first came out, because very low profile, very powerful gun, decent armor protection on the frontal sphere. But we have a problem. The tank is still cramped. The turret traverse is incredibly slow, the gun is unstabilized, and we just have general issues. So during the Hungarian Revolution, one of these was driven up into the British Embassy. They got to analyse it, and they introduced the British L7 gun. Now, the L7 gun was used on like everything. L7s can penetrate this thing quite easily. So the Soviets had to look onwards and upwards. So they looked at this hull, they looked at the gun, they looked at everything, and they developed this. So this is the T62. This was introduced in 1961. This tank ticks a couple of boxes. So the gun is definitely improved. This thing has a 115mm smoothbore gun. Okay, the first tank, like production tank, to have a smoothbore gun. But we do encounter some problems. So, we'll just start off with it. We'll just go over what the tank does. Okay, so we have a 5% increase on the hull armor and a 15% increase on the turret armor over T54. We have a much better gun, and we have those same design principles. So sideways engine and all that. Still has a loader, and the loading of this tank is notoriously slow. The rate of fire is lackluster compared to modern Western tanks. Okay. And T62, they built 22,700 of these tanks, and they are a decent tank. Okay, it also has a two-stage stabilizer, the Meteor stabilizer as well. So it's stabilized. It addresses some of the issues with the T54. The problem was, when this tank was being introduced, the US were introducing the M60, and the British were introducing the Chieftain. Not a good year for this tank, because the Allies, the NATO bloc, were just developing better tanks than this. So this thing got replaced, literally, well, not completely replaced, but this thing got outdone by the Soviet army literally 3 years later. Just going back a bit, one of the other problems with the T54 is it lacked an NBC protection system. That's where T55 comes in. So T55 is NBC capable. So this thing can fight in nuclear, biological, and chemical environments. Previously, the T54 could not fight. So it could survive a nuclear blast up to like 300 meters away, but the crew wouldn't last closer than 700 meters. So they had to address that, considering the context of the Cold War with nukes flying everywhere. So that's what T54 was basically designed to address, the problem of the lack of NBC protection and some other minor changes. Okay, so we've gotten the groundwork. We have the T54s and 55s. They're the sort of mass-producible exporting tanks that, you give to everyone. And then we have T62, which is technically better, but this thing's also twice as expensive as T54. But I can guarantee it's not twice as combat effective. It has a very long reloading 115mm gun. The armor protection's just been outdone by the introduction of, like, Western tanks with 120mm guns and heat rounds and all this other stuff. So 1961's not looking too good for the Soviet Union. Except they were already researching something better to begin with. I raise you one T64A. This thing was introduced in 1964, funnily enough, and this tank is incredible for its time. So the Soviet Union put out a requirement for a tank that would be well protected, low profile, well armed, with a weight of under 36 tons. Now, to do this, they had to do a couple of neat little things. So the first thing we get is the composite armor. So this thing has a sort of very raw early version of composite armor. This is the first production MBT to have composite armor on it. And what this essentially does is the composite armor, while being effective, also reduces the weight. Its effectiveness in steel would be much heavier. So composite armor, to me, on the first Soviet tanks, was mainly, like, to me, it was mainly put there to reduce the weight of the vehicle. The other thing they did to reduce the weight of the vehicle is this engine. So this engine is the 5TDF, and this is a very advanced, very compact power plant. As you can see, the engine deck on the T64 is very small. Indeed, it is literally half the size, half the volume of the T54's engine deck, right? Now, with a power plant like this comes its own problems, but we'll get to that in a minute. The other way that they reduced on the weight is they introduced an auto-loader to the vehicle. So initially this vehicle had this same 115mm gun on the T62, but they upgraded this to a 125mm gun. This is a 2A26 cannon, but this gun, essentially, with the 2A46 and the 2A82 that we have today, this gun remains, you know, this is the same gun that is used on every Soviet tank and every Russian tank today, which is something really interesting. So we get a vehicle that's very low profile, very small, only weighs 36 tons, has the armor of a heavy tank, has 125mm gun with an auto-loader, so it's only got 3 crew, and then we have this tiny engine which motors the thing around. This thing is truly the first main battle tank, and this tank is incredible for the time. This is revolutionary. The world has never seen anything like this. And there are still issues with this vehicle. When you develop a tank like this, there are always going to be costs. Indeed, they only produced 13,000 of these. These were never exported. There was no way in hell the Soviets were exporting their freshest technology. This thing came not 3 years after T62, okay? So, you know, this was their baby. And they kept this, but they still wanted to improve upon it. Now, it's interesting to note this was produced by a tank plant called Kharkiv in Ukraine. I probably can't pronounce these things, but I think we've gotten over the fact that I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian. So, Kharkiv tank plant are the ones who designed and produced this vehicle. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's off the top of my head. Now, Uralvagonzavod was forced to produce this tank, even though it was not theirs. In the Soviet Union, they obviously don't have copyright law, but interfactional rivalry, so to speak, made sure that Uralvagonzavod did not want to produce a tank that was not theirs. So, they started researching a production version of this tank that would cost and take it would take less to produce and would cost less to produce. And the main component that took so long to produce on this vehicle was this engine. So every Soviet tank engine so far has literally been a modification of the World War II T-34-85 engine. So here's where we get the Object 172, later the T-72. It took around 8 years to develop this vehicle. But what they did is they essentially took the T-64, kept all the good stuff on it. So they kept the higher technology guns and, well, the original T-72 just had steel armor. Now, people think that steel armor was probably ineffective, but 11 inches of steel armor with spacing is not ineffective. That was essentially them saying that the composite armor was a weight saver to me. That's why I think the composite armor on the first tank was a weight saving measure, because T-72 Ural, the first version, had composite armor, and it was just a, you know, I doubt many Western tanks of the time would get through that easily, especially not that turret. It's just an insane amount of armor. Weight goes up on T-72. This thing goes up to 41 tons over the previous 36 on the T-64. You can notice the engine deck is a lot more pronounced and it's a lot bigger. Now, the reason for this is because the the tank itself has the same V45, well, in this case it says V46, but it says the V45K engine in it. And what this is the old engine that all the other tanks have, the old power plant. So this thing can still motor around, it's not as good, but the thing is, this tank is 40% cheaper. It has a lot of the same technology. It also has a different auto-loading mechanism. So the auto-loading mechanism on this tank is like one above the other. So at first it feeds the round in, and then it feeds in the propellant. Well, yeah. Well, you'd have to feed the round in first. You couldn't feed the propellant in first, but, you know, the autoloader is a different sort of two-level autoloader, okay? And so T-72 was allowed to be... it was originally decreed to only be produced in wartime. And so it was called the wartime mobilization model of T-64. However, what they did find is that the benefits of having a tank this cheap with the same or similar level of technology was too good to pass up. So they eventually developed T-72 and decreed that Ural-Wagenzavod could start producing these, which they did. They estimated about 30,000 of these were produced across all the different factories that did produce this thing. So this is a very well-produced tank. This is probably the most produced third-generation MBT ever, which is really interesting. So you have that same situation the Soviets had before, where you have the higher technology tank, which is now T-64, and then you have the lower technology tanks, which are the T-54s. Now the thing is, T-54 and T-62 are still active and being modernized in the Soviet army. T-64 is, I see it as a way to replace all the heavy tanks. You know, just as an armoured vehicle. Whereas T-72 starts coming about, this thing gets exported to everyone. You know, this thing starts just going out left, right and centre. Of course, T-64 gets improved as well. Now, one of the main ways you can tell the difference between a T-72 and a T-64 is look at the road wheels. The engine deck at the back is much smaller, and the road wheels are tiny on T-64. But the T-64 hull can't take the bigger powertrain of the older tanks, so the sort of running gear and powertrain and the suspension all has to be improved. So yeah. So as you can see, with T-64B, the Soviets are still improving the tanks. They're adding explosive reactive armor. So the models are getting concurrently more advanced. T-64B was probably a very deadly tank when it first came out. Indeed, but that's like 10 years after it was produced. And then we go on to T-80. So T-80 comes into the picture. And T-80 is another question. So what if we took the T-64 hull and we mount a Konkin big gas turbine to it? So this is the first production tank, not counting the S-tank. The S-tank doesn't count. To me, I don't know why I hate the S-tank. I don't hate the S-tank, but just no. This is the first true, proper MBT to have a gas turbine engine, production-wise. And so the T-80 comes along, and the T-80's purpose is mainly just to see what happens if you put a gas turbine in a tank. And again, we're getting this ludicrously expensive vehicle coming along. Absolutely incredibly, like, just the gas turbine. You take the engine, like the problem with the T-64 was reliability and cost. You know, the T-64's engine reliability went down because of its compact size. You take all that and you put a gas turbine in it and you think it makes it better. Jesus. What you do get with T-80, the first T-80 was basically obsolete when it came out because it had a T-64A turret. And T-80B improves the turret heavily, and with later T-80BV you get proper protection. But the T-80 in itself, yeah, sure, it's got a massive, powerful power plant, but this thing was plagued with troubles with its engines. It's always the engines on these tanks. The armor is amazing on these vehicles for the time. The gun, absolutely incredible. Low profile vehicles. But to me, the main problem with Soviet tanks is they can't get their mind up. Engine. Which one do we use? Do we want to use a gas turbine, a compact engine, or the old World War II engine? Well, let's make all three. They would not settle on one vehicle. They would just continue moving up the scale and going with all these different models of tank. The Western Allies, NATO, they thought that all of these tanks were the same vehicle. They looked at them and went like, well, what's the difference between them? They've got the same gun. turrets look pretty damn similar. They've got these same dome turrets. What's the difference? They indeed literally thought that all of these tanks were the same tank, just with different models. Whereas the reality is, you know, T80 comes from T64, T72 comes from T64, but it's so different. All these different tanks, you know, they're all so wildly and, you know, just massively different in design. They've got all these different, you know, quirks to them. But what we end up with is a Soviet army with all these different main battle tanks in service. And, you know, we have to ask the question, you know, why was T80U being produced? So you can say the T80s sort of replaced the T64s as the high technology vehicle. Again, that concept of higher technology, low technology. But T64s don't go away. You know, T64s are still there, very modernized. T80U, still there, very modernized. Okay, T64s and T80Us and T72s are all still in production. And then what do we get with T72? Well, we get this version of the T72, which ends up being the T90. So, obviously, I don't have a T90 to show you right now, but it doesn't take a genius to, you know, have a look. T90 was developed from T72 with technology from the T80. This is where we look at the Soviet Union and its economy. The Soviet Union is what you would call a command economy. So there's no like market, it's a very state-driven economy. And one of the largest elements of the Soviet economy was its military-industrial complex. Having 5 separate tank factories, or however many they did have, I think there was like 3 major ones across the Soviet Union. They would build all these different tanks and equip them in the army because it kept the economy going. You know, these all these different vehicles, all these different like little experiments, they could afford to, you know, they weren't in war, they could afford to do all these different experiments with vehicles and have them in full production runs, you know, with thousands built, because the economy was basically run by building military equipment. You know, I'd say a vast majority of the Soviet economy. We don't actually know for sure because all the documentation is just weird. Half of it's Maskarovka to begin with, but you know, we can fairly safely say that all these standardizing production, streamlining production, on just one model of MBT like everyone else did. The Soviet economy, you know, they wanted their designs being built. They wanted their designs in their own factories. That's why we get all these different changes among the vehicles. But that's just my statement anyway. I would love more information to be published about this. There probably is. I just haven't dug very deep. Again, a lot of this is off the top of my own head. So, when we're looking at these Soviet tanks, I would love to know more. So, if you have any, if I've made any mistakes or, you know, any information is wrong, just let me know in the comments down below and I'll try to, you know, redact that. So, yeah. So, that's basically it. So, just to go over the differences between all these vehicles. T64s have very tiny road wheels and have a compact engine. T72s have much larger road wheels and a much bigger, longer engine deck. And then finally, the way you can tell a T80 is it's got those rather similar wheels to a T64, bit of a longer engine deck, and in general the vehicle's layout's just, you know, it's still got that sort of, it's like an in-between. The vehicle's deck isn't, like the engine isn't as small as T64's, but it's not as massive as T72's, so yeah. Alrighty, well I hope that sort of covers the whole topic, so I hope you guys have enjoyed. It's been your boy Garage Gaming, and I'll speak to you next time.